Hello, and welcome to the Accelerate Health podcast. Today's topic is innovation, and we're going to be talking with our guest, Troy Keyser from Carilion Health, about what it was like to innovate during the COVID pandemic in a smaller health system, the kind of health system we don't typically hear about on nightly newscasts or in newspapers, the kind of system that doesn't have millions of dollars and a giant staff and all sorts of resources at its disposal, but yet was faced with the same challenges that all hospitals had to face at the beginning of this pandemic in 2020. So I'd like to welcome my guest, Troy. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Rob. I'm really excited to be here, and thanks for asking me to join you.
You are quite welcome. And just so everyone knows, Troy and I worked together at some point in the past. So hopefully that can lead us to a little bit of a witty banter. So I would expect this to be quite a lively session here. We've known each other for some time. Troy, if you don't mind, just for the audience, give us a little bit about your background and tell us about Carilion Health. What's the system? How did you get there? And what's your role at Carilion?
Yeah, my pleasure. So I'm the founding director of Carilion Innovation. Carilion is located in Southwest Virginia. We serve about 1 million people in Virginia and West Virginia. We have about 730 physicians, really spanning the full spectrum of care with 70 different specialties. Previously, I lived in Boston, where I was there for 8 years, focusing on health IT innovation at Mass General Brigham, where I probably met with hundreds of innovators across the Mass General Brigham health system, reviewing their health IT innovations. My wife, a few years ago, got a position at Hollins University. So we moved down here in Roanoke. So my current work is really hanging out with the innovative folks here in Carilion who create new ways to improve care, be it through new medical devices, new systems or processes, or certain AI tools, developing things that will hopefully improve the care within our community, but hopefully is also transferable to other hospitals across the country.
So is it fair to say Carilion would be sort of a mid-sized health system, right? We're not talking Kaiser Permanente or Cleveland Clinic type system, but it is, a group of practices and facilities that serves a large area. And I think you said, Roanoke's about 100,000 people in the Roanoke area. Is that right?
There's about within the city itself, there's actually 300,000.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And we're right between Blacksburg and Charlottesville. So Virginia Tech and UVA are close by.
Got it. So I want this to be a discussion about innovation, but really can't talk about anything these days without mentioning something having to do with COVID and the pandemic, right? So if you don't mind, give us a little color. Tell us a little bit about what it was like back at the beginning of 2020 when the pandemic first came to Virginia, right? How did your health system, what did your health system do when suddenly you realized, COVID was in your backyard?
Well, it was an interesting experience because we saw the tidal wave coming in from the coast. So we would see these rates continue to increase in Boston, in New York, and in California. And I'll be honest, with my innovation manager and I, we had this hope that maybe it would just pass us by, right? It would just sort of stay in these higher populated areas, and we just sort of would be lucky, and it just wouldn't come. But then, around March, we had our first case. And then once that happened, a lot of folks, I would say starting in April, began sheltering in place, working from home. Our governor is a physician, so he didn't hesitate to put in a lot of executive orders to keep folks safe, requiring masks, halting gyms and things like that, in any sort of in-person service. And then it just sort of slowly continue to increase the number of cases and hospitalizations over the summer, and then to this current winter. So far, at least within the Carilion Clinic system, we've tapped out at about 120 folks hospitalized with COVID at any given time.
And so I want to set some groundwork here, because when we were discussing you joining us as a guest here. You told me a couple of fascinating stories about what you did, and I can't wait to get to them. But I want to clarify your role because I think it's important to what happened over the next few months. You got us to April so far, right? You're part of a formal innovation team. My experience tells me is rare for a hospital system your size, or at least not common for a hospital system your size, right? So tell us a little bit about that team and how that role was envisioned, and then we can get into how you and your team contributed to the way you guys handled the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are only, when I looked at the last American Hospital Association numbers, I think there's only about 64, maybe 67 hospitals that do have innovation groups. So it is relatively unique functionality to have. So when I first moved here, this role didn't exist. Carilion Clinic did want to stand up an innovation department, but finding the right talent, sort of being able to import folks into the area can be a bit tricky. So it was extremely serendipitous. I was a trailing spouse, and they happened to have, there's a lock and a key, and it just really worked out there. So while I was launching Carilion Innovation, which is really more focused on commercializable inventions, COVID hit, and which was just devastating. I don't mean to laugh and make light of it, but it completely changed, using the same skill sets, but it did change the trajectory and what the type of innovations that we were working on. It wasn't about, hey, can we commercialize this? Hey, can we license out our intellectual property? It was, hey, we have a critical need. We need a stopgap invention yesterday. How can we take the tools that we have and the partners within our system, like the engineers at Virginia Tech and their labs for 3D printing, or Virginia Western, which is a community college that has an amazing brand new fab lab. How do we work with them to create needed PPE? So rather than licensing to industry, it was about more of an inward direction of how are we meeting the immediate needs of our frontline staff. So a task force in April was sort of snapped together. So it's Carilion Innovation, the Human Factors team, which is led by Dr. Sarah Parker. There's a business strategy team, and we also have our Center for Simulation. And we also had a clinical researcher and bioengineer, Dr. Andy Millenier. So our task force snapped together and triaged, I would say, over 70 novel ideas, novel PPE that was coming in. Our community was, and I think this was like many other areas, they wanted to do anything they could do to help. What can we do? People literally bringing out their sewing machines, sewing masks, bringing it to our doors and saying, is this helpful? Would you like this? And I remember I was telling you this before, Rob, we had distilleries saying, hey, I got 50 gallons of hand sanitizer. Where can I drop it off? So having a process to triage, all of this wonderful goodwill to make sure it was hitting the right people internally, but then on the inverse, making sure that we were communicating where our actual gaps resided, and ensuring we had a process to address those gaps.
There's so much in here, right? We'll try and keep this on time for the audience here. We could do this in 3 or 4 different episodes. There is a story that you told me about a particular piece of PPE equipment that you guys managed to get to help the situation that every hospital was facing, right? Yeah. In the beginning, I mentioned Carilion was in a different position than big systems. I live in Massachusetts. That's how Troy and I met years ago. Not every state has Robert Kraft, the owner of the New England Patriots, who took his airplane, his own personal team airplane, and flew it to China to bring back hundreds and hundreds of thousands of KN95 masks to distribute to Massachusetts hospitals, right? I'm assuming Carilion doesn't have a 737 at its disposal on the runway to do a quick run to China for hundreds of thousands of masks, right?
Yeah, we do have a local airport, but no, Carilion doesn't have a personal plane or anything like that to go to China. No.
Right, and I think that's what makes this story so fascinating, because it's not particularly difficult. There's great innovation stories anywhere, but it's much easier to be innovative when you have those kinds of resources at your disposal, right? as opposed to, being in a smaller community. But the fascinating piece I want to get to is you just mentioned in a smaller community, right? Between Roanoke and Blacksburg, you had an engineering department at a renowned university not willing, but ready to work with you. You had a community college with amazing setups to sort of build and fabricate things. And so while we hear in big headlines across the nation, right? Well, manufacturing is dead in America. We can't build anything here anymore. My experience tells me that's not true. I think it sounds like your experience says that's probably not true anymore. And I want to get into that a little bit. Let's frame a challenge, right? So you mentioned PPE, I've mentioned PPE. Every hospital had a challenge with personal protective equipment, primarily masks, right? Tell us a little bit about what you guys were facing on the mask front, and then I think we can get into that awesome story that you can share with us.
Yeah, like many hospitals, the need for masks and masks that could stand the test of time, a lot of wear and tear, right? These masks were originally created, not to be worn for extended periods of time. So but that's what we needed to do to conserve our PPE, and we needed to figure out new ways of maintaining our respirators wherever that may be. So one item that we were using was it's called a half-face respirator or elastomeric mask. And basically, for folks who aren't familiar with this, it's made out of plastic, and it operates just like an N95. You have filters on each side of the mask. So as you inhale, that air is filtered that you're breathing in. It's made out of sort of full plastic, so you can dunk, you can wash it. I mean, it's a real sort of rugged mask. And it can be personalized too. You can really kind of figure out a really nice snug fit.
And so let me just throw a little color in here, right? So I'm a chemist by training, and these are the types of masks you see used all the time in industrial settings, right? I have two in my garage now because I'm also a hobby metal worker. I'm constantly grinding all kinds of metal and fine particulates and dust and whatever. But even when I was doing hazardous materials cleanup earlier in life, right? You go through respirator fitting, you get the little smelly banana smelling stuff to make sure that it's not leaking. You gotta, if you're a man with facial hair, you have to keep it trimmed so it fits. This is industrial grade equipment we're talking about here.
And they were really, I don't think a lot of people realize that these types of masks are a real lifesaver for folks. As we had a dearth of N95s, and as we were trying to do the decon process, and those straps on those N95s were really just coming apart. The fabric would be fine, but you couldn't get a secure fit because the elastics, going through so many cycles of decontamination, it wasn't built for that. That's not what it was built for. So these really rugged, industrial grade masks were a real lifesaver for our system. Now, the interesting part about these masks is the exhalation, so the actual source exhaling out wasn't filtered. It wasn't filtered. So usually when we would triage, or our process for triaging these needs is, one, we go to our materials management group and we have them do a market scan. We do a market scan and say, hey, how are folks solving this? Is there already a product in the market that we can sort of place on this device? Because we don't want to have to actually make this stuff. Like this is that last step, right? We don't necessarily want to be building this stuff ourselves. It'd be much easier just to be able to purchase it ourselves. Look at the market, and there was nothing there. We spoke with our executive sponsors, we spoke with our clinical end users, we spoke with infection and prevention, and every single one of them said, this is a critical need. And there's nothing in the market to solve this.
And having come at this from the industrial side, right? That's a product feature, right? This is not a deficiency. As some of my some of my old friends who work in some tough factory type and other settings would tell you, right? When you've had this mask on for 9 hours, it's 104 degrees, right? Because you're in some kind of boiler room somewhere, right? You're hanging half upside down trying to weld a joint on a pipe that's impossible to get to. The last thing you want is something that makes your breathing more difficult, right? So these are designed for industrial users doing heavy work to be able to exhale quickly while protecting themselves from the environment around them. So yeah, now you're saying, ooh, we got to completely change the nature of this product, right? So I think what happens next was fascinating when you told it to me. So please go on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it makes perfect sense, right? I mean, this is our first, since once in a 100-year respiratory pandemic that's occurring, it makes sense that the market it didn't have products available to address this particular extremely rare circumstance, right? So it's no, and it makes sense that industry, is very efficient with what products they focus on and what they're building towards. So yeah, I mean, the use case for these half-face respirators wasn't necessarily thinking with the idea that there'd be a huge respiratory pandemic occurring. So exhalation valve not filtered. Okay, great. There isn't resistance for folks doing, heavy work with these devices. What we realize is that it's okay. The market doesn't have something available. So we need to build something ourselves. We even reached out to 3M. We reached out to other infectious disease departments with many other hospitals and asking them the same question, how are you trying to solve this problem? And every single one of them said, I've reached out to Honeywell, I've reached out to 3M, and they just sort of, they don't have an answer for us. So we had a physician assistant in our interventional radiology group go on the universeofthings.com. And there was a bit of a device that someone, it was on it like, it almost looked like a vacuum napkin, a little design, and then a little bit of a CAD, STL file of what you are able to just pop it on, what a holder and the retainer, and then you put the filter material in, just a little device to sort of click on to that exhalation valve. So when you breathe out, may not have that perfect 100% seal, but you're getting enough coverage there that you will get some of that filtration on that device. So we took that design, we brought it to and this is something that we just stood up in the midst of all of this going on. We were like, we need a makerspace. So this was on my product roadmap for Carilion Innovation. And I was like, oh yeah, okay, I'll hopefully build up enough of a use case a couple years from now, and I can really get some wonderful Formlabs printers. There was a bit of a silver lining in saying, oh, no, we need these now because we need to rapidly prototype this device. We had our simulation center to try this on with our mannequins and actually simulate respiration and seeing what it was like. So through a couple series of rapid prototyping, figuring out the right materials to use, we had an exhalation device that was approved by our infection prevention team, approved by our legal team, which is incredible. that was the rub. And approved by our head of infection prevention. And of course, we went through, and this is one of the key wonderful things as well, of having this human factors team, going through and doing a set of user testing with 20 folks and really seeing, hey, do you feel that resistance? Right? Do you feel that resistance as you're breathing out? Does this impact your ability to perform tasks? And doing that over 3 shifts with the device and really having that data and seeing what was occurring with, wear and tear of the device, what it felt like to breathe with the device on. And the other interesting part of having this human factors team, so when we did our testing with having folks wear it for 1 shift, so for 1 shift. We did get some feedback from maybe 30% of folks where they were like, hey, I'm really feeling that resistance. This is difficult. Well, our human factors experts were like, because for me, as DIY product manager now for a medical device, which is not, Rob knows I'm not necessarily trained to do. I can kind of figure it out. They stated, well, wait a minute. For me, I was like, oh gosh, this is a problem. The fact that this is occurring, this really may be an issue. Folks are having that resistance, and they're feeling that they're not able to breathe properly. Once again, it's just a subset. And the human factors team, their feedback was, well, wait a minute, we might have an acclimation that may occur once folks get used to wearing it. So let's do it for 3 shifts. And they were right. Folks just needed to get used to it. And we had done the testing before of saying, hey, what is the resistance on our machines that we were seeing without any filter on, and what's the level of sort of pressure and resistance we're getting when we put the valve on. And it was near negligible. I mean, it was just, the difference was barely even picked up by our tools that were measuring this resistance. But perceptually, there was something there. But then that acclimation process occurred.
Well, I think that's the fascinating part of the story for me about human factors, right? So there's a couple areas I'd love to explore here. You mentioned you used some 3D printing here, right? And I happen to be sitting next to the 3D printer in my office, right? So I was one of those guys at the beginning. People kept calling me, can you make this for a face mask? Can you make this? What about face shield stuff? And my instinct, having been in 3D printing for a long, long time as a hobbyist, right? There's a big difference between what my machine puts out in quality and feel versus what comes out of an injection molding machine that 3M owns for some industrial process. And I can make things, I can rapidly prototype things, but at some point, when we get to the human factors, it still may feel, my part may feel like it was made in a garage, because it was not made in an industrial machine. And that can go, I think that plays into the qualitative experience that you're talking about. When someone fits this new plastic part to their valve, does it look like a toy or does it look like it belongs there? Can you tell me a little bit about how that played in and how your human factors people think about those sorts of things, just the look and feel of a product, not just the function?
When we have these devices going to the front line, I mean, just think of it from that healthcare worker standpoint, right? You are, first of all, you're extremely burnt out. You're very worried about resources in general. You're feeling that scarcity, and most of the time that is real scarcity that is occurring. And someone hands you this device that's like in a Ziploc bag, it's very rough. Like looks a little, maybe there's a little like issues here and there, a little bumps.
Sketchy might be the word.
Still does the function. Yeah, sketchy. Yeah, and you just, I mean, you can empathize with that situation very easily. Where you're like, you're not going to feel very taken care of. So as William James, the founding psychologist, said, your perception is your reality. So that can transfer when you put that device on. You feel like, hey, there's something off about this. This doesn't feel right, because it's not like that super slick industrial grade product grade product that you're used to interacting with. So that was a key part when we were doing our user testing and saying, hey, getting something that is also at that higher level will help with folks' perception and understanding of the quality itself. So we worked with another local company that for the longest time just handled creating custom stamps. And they're now pivoting, realizing there's a whole market with creating custom products and custom packaging for folks. So they created a nice sort of custom packaging for the device, so it's not like in a Ziploc bag, with using the Carilion colors, on the material itself and the stickers itself, and it just imbues it with this care that I think translates to how folks feel about the device as they interact with it. The next layer I'll go to as well is exactly, Rob. Like, we had some 3D printers that were really quick churning them out, but the ones that we actually use for what folks are using today they're not necessarily injection mold, because that took too long for us. We needed it now, right? But we at least got that one step up of a Formlabs printer, which is literally the one that we have is a medical grade printer. and with Virginia Tech, we were very fortunate. There's something called the Dreams Lab there, which is just a world-renowned 3D printing lab, and they use nylon powder 3D printer, and it's just really crisp and clean. And there was a graduate student who wanted to learn, how do you make something at that real, like, product grade, have that shine and zhuzh. And that person just did I know, right? Just did a great job in just rounding out all those edges, right? And labeling it, and just that care that you would like to see from that healthcare worker's perspective. You would want to see with the products that you're using and taking care of patients.
Yeah, and I think this has been one of the reasons this resonated with me so much is this has been something I've thought about in this innovation field, particularly in healthcare, for years. So when Troy and I worked together, we shared a floor for a while outside Mass General Hospital with a group of people from an imaging innovation lab, right? They wrote a lot of software around imaging, and they were working on several things. One day, one of the guys, since I'm a tech guy, came to me, said, hey, take a look at this. This is cool. Apple had just really started putting the Retina display on some of their devices. And he said, look, we came up with this viewer, and this is how old I am. This was a while ago, but they came up with this viewer. You can now look at radiology images on an iPad, right? Isn't this great? And at some point, my first reaction was, I don't know, right? If I'm a patient and I'm in Mass General Hospital, right? One of the hospitals touted as the first, certainly, and one of the best general hospitals in the world. And I have a doctor come and say, well, you have a very obscure tumor in your brain that we're going to have to operate on. Here, let me take out my iPhone and show it to you. I fully expect that doctor, when they're thinking about this, to be standing in front of a room full of screens, like a Hollywood movie, right? I want that thing blown up to 8 feet high, 17 feet wide, high definition. I don't want someone who's going to be poking around inside of me, plotting their next move on an iPhone or an iPad, right? I assume there's some big purpose-built screen somewhere. And I think a lot of
they get like a push notification from Grubhub,
Yeah, exactly. Oh yeah,
like,
sorry.
What? sorry. My takeout's here. Okay, anyways, back to your tumor. Yeah.
Right. So the fascinating part of this story for me was this idea that your human factors people and others could help you recognize this, and how perception can cloud the reality of this. And so I think, to me, that's the fascinating part of innovation here. We all went through this at the beginning of the pandemic. How can we help? How can I sew masks at home? How can I use my 3D printer at home? How can I do this? And sometimes the answer is you can't. You can help a little bit by generating this device, test it at home, but that doesn't mean you can then print 100 of them, drive up to a hospital, knock on the door and say, here, use these, right? Because you have staff who have their own worries. I know a lot of nurses and doctors and other things. Mutual friends of ours, we're scared to death of bringing something home to their family, scared to death of wearing a mask and spreading this to patients who weren't in for COVID, the normal healthcare stuff that was still happening. And being able to build something that actually gives them a sense of comfort, I think was the most important thing for me here. Let me ask a different story now. So you were relatively new, a few years to this community, a smaller town in Virginia. You came from the same sort of place as I do, although you're originally from a smaller part of New England as well, right? So small town life isn't totally new to you. But we hear a drumbeat. Again, manufacturing is dead in America. America is losing its innovation edge. We don't build anything here anymore. And you've just told me about new 3D printing machines that were available to you in a smaller part of the country, engineering departments who are experimenting with entirely new ways to produce high quality industrial grade products. What do you feel, having gone through this experience, about how America is doing right now? And what do you feel about the future as you think about getting back to your innovation roadmap? What do you just think about what you've gone through and the people around you?
The manufacturing here, there's such a deep care and attention to what they're producing. It's not okay, just barely good enough. These are the design requirements. Have we If we basically hit them, can we, with a straight face, say that we've checked that box of, the level of flexibility that's occurring? When you have the ability to manufacture, package, and then deliver that product all within that same community, there's a level of responsibility and care that just occurs, that just naturally occurs. You're going to see this person at the grocery store. My kids may go to Virginia Tech and have that person as their professor. So I think that when you have it all locally and within this very tight supply chain, there is that care, that extra care that you want to provide, because you are a part of that same community. And then on the other side too is you have that opportunity to, when you have the supply chain sort of collapse so close together, that lost in translation, you think of the game of telephone, right? Mm-hmm. Well, we're all talking together, or we're able to really rapidly quick, and I'm able to text, Chris Williams, the head of Dreams Lab, and say, hey, just got the pieces. We just tested it in the simulated environment. Oh, by the way, the louvers, they're pointed down, or they're pointed up. It'd be better if they pointed down. No problem, and able to go in and fix it, and then upload it in our shared, cloud environment, that new STL design. That level of rapid communication, and therefore ensuring the needs of the user, right? Having that human-centered approach, that human factors approach, allows for a higher level of fidelity of what would be best. And then you have that back to that foundation of care for the community, and you're going to be successful. Like that's just what's going to happen.
Troy, we're coming a little bit to the end of our time here, but I want to ask one. I'm not going to let you off the hook for one thing. So we had a bit of a chuckle earlier at some lawyer's expense, right? You talked about getting the lawyer's approval. That was the hard part, right? Innovating in a pandemic, getting some stuff manufactured out of thin air. That's the easy part. Getting the lawyers to say, okay. Our mutual friend, Mike Carter, who we worked with from Mass General Brigham, was on this podcast a few weeks ago. And I asked him one tip, give me one tip for a system that doesn't have the resources of Mass General Brigham. What would be one thing you would tell somebody in his case as they were looking to build out or add to their telemedicine capacity? And he said, find a tech savvy lawyer and get that person on your staff, right? The tech savvy lawyer will smooth the way, right? You eventually got your approvals done. You want to agree or disagree with Mike? How do you feel about that? Where, did you find that lawyer, and were you able to really, get stuff done because of a specific person, or was it just a struggle the whole way?
I can't agree with Mike enough. Being able to have that buy-in from a lawyer is like the golden ticket. It's like this nice little seal that you get to wrap around the project that you're doing. But that seal is something that takes time. It takes coaching and your best ability to sort of explain a project to a legal person, right? Because for them, the vision is take no risks. What is everything that's going to go wrong? But those are so important to have. To have in an institution anyways. I mean, you need to have some people who think that way. Having the first initial conversations with our legal team, it just took a second to sort of and I think this is for everyone, to just wrap their heads around what exactly we're doing, and then truly, where are those risks, and what is that mitigation plan that we can create to make this palatable and an ability to go forward. So one, definitely, I wish I engaged my legal team sooner, because there's always that fear of like, oh God, they're just going to squash this. And I wish I just put that to the side and we reached out to them sooner. But at the same time, I mean, we were innovating in a pandemic. I mean, I shouldn't be, too hard on myself. Yeah. Trying my best. We're all trying our best. Once she had enough information, and it took a couple conversations. Having that person find the right expert within their external counsel group that they felt comfortable with, that was a missing link too, of just like, hey, because I tried to bring in, hey, I have this FDA expert, like I have this person. And it's like, they having them guide and figure it out. Because at the end of the day, they do want patient benefiting products, processes, policies, whatever it is to occur. They're on the same page as you. And then once we had that, then it was just literally simple. I mean, I just remember that email, just thinking about that email now, where it was just like, oh, okay, great. As long as you follow X, Y, Z, Z, you're good. And it was so simple.
Yeah.
I mean, deceitfully so, but yeah, there you go.
So if I'm going to summarize this conversation quickly, I think the couple of key takeaways for me are, don't discount the human factors, right? The look, the feel, the way a product arrives in front of somebody has a lot to do with the perception of their perception of how that product may perform, right? And that's hard. Never mind the fact that, as you pointed out, only a few dozen hospitals have an innovation team. I doubt that many hospitals have human factors people right there on staff participating in that innovation community. I think we've highlighted the differences between rapid prototyping. Yeah, there's a lot you can do. You can get 90% of the way there in your garage with a $200 printer, but at some point, this is going to become a real product and it needs to step up a level into sort of a new thing. And a friend of mine runs a business here in Massachusetts and reached out to me during the pandemic, said, hey, could you make one of these for my customer? And my answer was, yeah, of course, like probably 3 hours to come off the printer. But that doesn't mean they're going to look at it and say, I'm willing to pay money for it, right? So if you want me to try, make sure this works, sure. But at some point, you're going to have to find somebody with an industrial printer. That's $3,000, not $300, or $30,000, not $300. And the level of quality you get out of those things is important. And then the last one, I think the lawyer one is so important. The story I used to tell when people had asked me to speak to young innovators, I used to put a scene from the old TV show MASH out in, for people who remember that. I'm old enough that I watched MASH when it was still on TV. And in it, the two main characters are doctors in an Army surgical hospital. They're sitting around playing cards and drinking, wearing gorilla costumes, right? Just to liven up the camp a little bit. And their nemesis, another doctor, Frank Burns, needs surgery on a hernia that he's let go too long. And they have to sort of beg these guys. They hate each other, but they have to beg these doctors, could you please operate on him? And the main character, Hawkeye Pierce, goes, hold on, let me consult with my colleague. And then they start making grunting and gorilla noises. And he comes back and he says, first of all, I want to know, why does everybody wait so long before they consult the gorilla, right? I play that when I give the same discussion you have. I have never gone wrong by bringing a lawyer in early in any business project I've ever had, right? In my experience, most lawyers don't say no just for the joy of saying no. There are legitimate concerns. And if you can address them early, adjust your designs or adjust your expectations, you end up in the end being able to move much faster as the project comes to conclusion. So that's twice now, 2 lessons from real life people in crisis situations who've said, it's never too early to bring a lawyer in. And especially if you can find a tech savvy lawyer, to your point, with a network that they trust, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to leave one more story here very quickly. It's probably my favorite innovation story of all time. There was a gentleman named Paul McCready who invented 2 human-powered airplanes, Gossamer Albatross, Gossamer Condor. He is widely lauded and has received hundreds of awards for, back in the 1970s, inventing or putting in place what we would now call sort of this rapid fail-fast environment. He built a whole bunch of planes trying to win a prize against the likes of Boeing and McDonnell Douglas and billion-dollar corporations. He did it using balsa wood, plastic, and parts from a hardware store, which, as he said, enabled him to win because he could build and crash 3 or 4 airplanes a day, right? Whereas Boeing and their engineers and their designers would take 18 months to even build a prototype wing to test. So by rapidly iterating, he was able to do it faster. The story for most people ends there. But later on, about 15 years later, he was honored at the Smithsonian Institution for Innovation. And in his speech, he said these words, which have stuck in my head forever. He said, perhaps my naivete was exactly what was needed for that pioneering age of flight. But thank goodness the wings of airliners on which I now spend so much time are designed by professional structural engineers and not by me. Yeah. And so if I had to leave one last punctuation mark on this conversation, right? I think your story is incredible to me. That you and others at Carilion had the foresight to identify some experts in the organization, experts in human factors, to maybe recruit or bring people in. to have that network of engineers, right? Professional academic engineers with a lab who could build those things. We all love to hear the story about the person who did it all on their own, but nobody does it on their own, right? We all stand on the shoulders of giants. We stand shoulder to shoulder with giants sometimes, and everybody has a contribution to make. And if that's the last bit of summary I would give here, right? That what you went through was a team effort. It required real expertise. You mentioned your head of human factors as Dr. Somebody, right? There's a PhD somewhere in there. There are lawyers, right? JDs. There are educated people and others who were able to bring the product over the finish line. Sure, an idea was found on Thingiverse. Could have been a teenager in a garage who came up with the idea. But there's a big difference between coming up with an idea and bringing it over the finish line to something that inspires confidence in its users and makes people happy to accept it and make it a part of, their own protection, things that they're worried about. So anything else you want to add at the end of this, Troy? I'll give the floor back to you for a minute or two.
I think you captured it really well. Scaling the exhalation device is another key part that, you can't just sort of do it in your homegrown, not only just the quality of it, but, the scale that we needed to get, hundreds and thousands across the system. And having the confidence that over time it would be able to handle the wear and tear of that use. It's these 3D printing has done wonders in rapid prototyping, but also these new industry grade 3D printers that are more expensive do help us get to that industry grade, that product level fabrication that we're looking for. But of course, injection molding, having the full 3M suite of capabilities and resources is always best. But when it's not available and you need to protect people, you have to figure it out. You got to figure it out.
Well, Troy, I would like to say thank you for joining us here today and sharing the story. It was very good for me to reconnect with you again, and I hope we can talk at some other point as we follow you in your journey for getting back to your roadmap after our one year and a half detour we've all taken from what we thought we'd be doing in 2020. So thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.